Please welcome Brother Claude.
Thank you very much. And yes, it was a great drive down. As I was mentioning to a few of you, it was still dark and chilly, and my windows were staying fogged up as I was driving out. So I lowered the windows to help with the defrost, and then they would not go back up. And so I said, well, this is inconvenient, but I decided I'm going to make this an invigorating experience. And so I'm very awake right now. But it's great to be here. And yes, to share with you a little bit about the Knights and Ladies of St. Peter Claver and the auxiliaries. There's the junior Knights and Ladies as well. I'm a member of Council 406 here in Orange County, the Sister Thea Bowman Council. And you can read a little bit about the Knights and Ladies in Orange County by Googling the article from a year or so ago in the Orange County Catholic. And that shares a bit more about some of the key figures, including Bishop Van, who is a member, and also Greg, her, and also Gunnar. There's a few, I think, names and maybe even some faces will be familiar to you when you look at the article. And if you're interested, I know Greg's contact information is actually in the article itself, so you can call him or text him directly to get more involved, should you feel God leading you in that direction. What I have for you today is another article, and you'll forgive me, they're not stapled, but I think you can pass them around like that way. It's an article from 1910. Okay, so it's just after the Knights were founded in Mobile, Alabama, by a group of priests and laymen. Josephite priests. I was taught by Josephites. Josephites are a home missionary congregation, originally part of the Mill Hill missionaries in England, and then some of those fathers were working with former enslaved Africans in the Americas after the Civil War, and especially in the South. And for a variety of reasons, this community was started, the Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver. There's a couple different angles from which we could treat the historic establishment of this group. And so I'll give you a couple and then just open it up for Q&A, because we don't have too much time, but it's more to get a little bit of insight. Now, by way of just showing hands, how many of us are Knights of Columbus by chance? Okay, I figured a lot of us. Okay, so right. So I know we'll hear about the Knights of St. Lazarus as well. But probably the Knights of Columbus are the most well-known, at least in the United States. And I'm also a Knight of Columbus. So I'm a 4th degree Knight of Columbus and 4th degree Knight of St. Peter Claver. Well, we know that that organization was founded in the late 1800s, very much to provide a sort of social and financial safety net for many marginalized Catholic immigrants in the United States. Okay, I could say more about it, but let's just say that's one of the main reasons the Knights of Columbus was established. Well, at least in the South, okay, by the early 1900s, when the Knights of Peter Claver were established for Black Catholics, it was not possible for many of these men to be members of the Knights of Columbus. And again, that's not to single out the Knights of Columbus as an organization at all, but when I grew up, I went to 5 Catholic schools in New Orleans growing up, 3 of which were de facto segregated, not because things were legally segregated in the 80s and 90s, but it was historically set up that way. And so, for instance, the first school I attended was run by an order of sisters, which are pretty much exclusively African American, and that's because when they were founded, in 1842, kind of juridically. They started even before then. It was illegal for black women religious and white women religious to live in the same house in Louisiana, and so we had to have these separate institutions. And so that is one of the reasons we have the Knights of St. Peter Claver, that there was a felt and even perceived need to provide the same sort of social and financial protections for black Catholics, especially those who were being ministered to by the Josephites, but also others. And so this organization was founded. Also because, at the time and even now, for Catholics, we have sort of limited access, you could say. We're normally not into a lot of other secret societies. Let's just say that, okay? And so there were many inroads in the black community in the South, and so in order to kind of balance that off, just from the perspective of the secular environment, there was really a need for an organization that better resonated with Catholic values. So that's kind of one aspect. Now another thing, another angle that's present from the beginning, and I was talking to Greg, who's our Supreme Knight here in Orange County, about his own journey into the Knights, and he also has another sort of description of the spirituality of the Knights of Peter Claver. And so this will be the second point, then I'll give the story of St. Peter Claver himself as well. And he says that what he was struck with is this agape love as part of the general approach to how the Knights of St. Peter Claver operate, which is to say, to focus on Christ, who is present, of course, in Eucharist, but also in his mystical body, and finding concrete ways to be of assistance to one's neighbor, to be a real welcoming face of Christ in a community. My first recollections of the Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver are just, I actually can't even say when, because it's a very big organization in New Orleans where I grew up, and even though it was founded in Mobile, the current headquarters are in New Orleans, and the current headquarters have been there at least since the 50s, if not before, and not far from where I grew up. It's just on Orleans Avenue. And I was just home in New Orleans a couple weeks ago for my youngest brother's wedding, and I had reason a few times to drive by the international headquarters of the Knights of St. Peter Claver. Well, anyway, when I went to college, I graduated in high school in '98, and I was discerning priesthood at the time. And so even though I didn't go right into seminary, I did have a seminary program that I was a part of at my university. And it was the Knights and Ladies of St. Peter Claver from St. Matthias Church in New Orleans who sent me off with a huge dorm care package. And that's the sort of thing, that we're about as Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver, is to really be attentive to ways in which we can support vocations, but also young people and students, and again, in concrete ways. Well, so I would just throw this out, and then again, last point about St. Peter Claver, and then I'll give you a few minutes to ask some questions. St. Peter Claver, by the way, I know some of you already know a little bit about him, was a Jesuit, basically from the, say that again? Sorry. Oh, yes. And my patron saint is also a Jesuit, St. Claude. So even though I'm a Norbertine by profession, spiritually I'm very connected to the Society of Jesus as well. Well, he was a missionary to enslaved Africans who were coming into Central America in the 1700s. And lots of stuff we could talk about his spirituality. I am struck by the fact that he had a line to always preach Christ first by deeds before by words. And so he would welcome off of these slave ships the people with food and medicines and his smile and an embrace. That is a very, very important way in which we communicate the good news. He was also very adamant about teaching the new converts the act of contrition, which I think is also another interesting approach. That is to understand the woundedness which we all experience, and to really have a spirituality of seeking God's forgiveness as we extend it to others. But anyway, because of St. Peter Claver's ministry to Africans who were basically brought over as enslaved people into the Americas, he was a natural patron for the organization. And so I think if we again look at this, that there's sort of financial and societal reasons for the establishment of the Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver. There's kind of a very ancient scriptural spirituality as well, which is part of the organization, particularly to try to live the apostolic way of life, just being present one to another at Mass, at Eucharist, but also in the assembly outside of Mass. And also, I would say this kind of Jesuit missionary component of the spirituality, which seeks to be very, very present, again, in concrete, accessible ways. So, there's the being useful as an organization, but then there's also being useful just on one-on-one. And so much of the love we experience really is one-on-one. Communication is often takes place that way. And so it's now, I would say there's, we speak more about it in terms of social justice. That's kind of, I guess you could say, the way in which we describe that sort of activity today, in many circles at least. But basically, this was the approach of the founders of the Knights. And so I'd like to just stop talking at you now and just give you a chance to ask some questions. Yes.
Thank you, Father. That was a really interesting talk, and I didn't know of the existence of your organization, so I feel very blessed to learn about it. My question is, do you think that this charism of agape love comes from the example of your patron? And then what type of activities, I imagine, that you do, that your organization does for to build that solidarity and reconciliation between people of different ethnic backgrounds?
Yes, well, I mean, to build solidarity between people of different ethnic backgrounds, that's a good question. I would say the Knights and Ladies are open to Catholics of any ethnic background, and so Orange County is a good example of that. Our chapter, it's fairly ethnically diverse. We're a small group anyway. It was just over a dozen or so members. But most of the juridic leaders of the Orange County chapter are not African American. And there's a few other examples of that depending on where you would go. But I would say one of the ways that seems most powerful to me is actually just through the liturgical styles of worship. When you participate, definitely since the Council, since the Second Vatican Council, the Knights and Ladies of St. Peter Claver have really provided a context wherein much more evidently African American music and symbolism is present in the liturgies. And so whenever events are hosted, Catholics, usually as we did this morning, we gather around, the altar. And so that would be one way in which I think the interaction between different ethnic groups is maybe manifest and made evident. Yes?
Man founded in Mobile in living in New Orleans South at the, at the time, turn of the century, the 1800s. How many black people of different faiths came in contact with the Knights, asking for help, and how many did that lead to conversions and things?
Well, I would say, I don't have like statistics, but I would say anecdotally, I would think lots, because for instance, in Louisiana where I grew up, you'll have the general phenomena of Catholic churches all over. And even in neighborhoods, for instance, where there might be many blacks who are not themselves professed Catholics, because of the Catholic school system and the presence of Catholic institutions, the Catholic Church is just a very familiar sort of reality. When I was in high school, I worked at a Catholic bookstore in New Orleans, and I remember several Sunday school teachers, Black American Sunday school teachers from Protestant churches, would come in for Catholic holy cards, because it's just, we make kind of distinctions about who's Catholic, and depending on the city or the place, that may not be that, it may not be so black and white or so clear, basically, because, it's just, some cultures, there's just too much intermarriage, and so things get a little bit blurred, yes. I remember once I had a wedding for a couple, and it was like sort of a non-practicing Jewish-Irish groom, and then a black Catholic bride. It was an interesting wedding reception. It was fun, but again, there's a lot of mixing. It was, yes. Yes.
St. Peter Claver, did he have a lot of persecution for doing this? I mean, I'm thinking he probably wouldn't have been very accepted by the whites to reach out to the blacks.
Yes, I mean, he did have some. I think he had supporters, but yes, he had a fair amount of opposition as well. But St. Peter Claver baptized 300,000 slaves. So I mean, he had quite an impact, Yes.
When was he there again? How was all of this?
When did St. Peter Claver die? Actually, it's 17.
Just
Oh, the early 1700s.
okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't want to run over my time,
So actually, it just dawned on me. These are great questions, particularly about the interaction of cultures and how the Catholic Church is in some ways has been a segregated history, but on the other hand, it's been an integrated history, particularly in the last 70 years. Well, we happen to have the former executive director for the USCCB's Office on Interreligion and Ecumenism, who's also going to be speaking to us about the Knights of St. Lazarus. So, Father, I'm going to just ask you, your experience here in Orange County before going to D.C., give us some thoughts about our local interaction with non-Catholic Christians, maybe the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the leadership that's in that. What are your thoughts just in terms of people coming together around the table?
Well, the landscape has changed quite dramatically, actually, because I grew up in Orange County. I was born here. And when I was in college, I would say there was tremendous friction between ourselves and the evangelical churches, especially Calvary Chapel. And there was probably no relationship at all with the Orthodox churches. So we were probably still much, we'll call it isolated, but they were too, all the other churches. And today that would be quite different now. We have a fairly warm relationship with the evangelical churches, and a lot of that due to Saddleback and Rick Warren, who's been very, very helpful in that area. A lot of people don't know that when Chuck Smith was dying, Bishop Brown wrote him a letter and said, "I'm praying for you that you'll be restored back to the people." And I remember Bishop week after week asked me, did he write back? Did he write back? And no, nothing. And finally I said to the bishop, maybe we don't get anything back, but what's important is you wrote, from the church. Well, we did get a letter back. And was a beautiful letter where he thanked the bishop and asked him to keep praying for him. And that related a story about how when he was a young man, he would often go to visit his aunt, who was a nun, and sit in the convent talking to her about Jesus.
Amen.
So it was a beautiful testimony and witness of something that was happening way back then. I don't think he was ever a Catholic. I think he was brought up in the Protestant church. So I think maybe Christians from Calvary Chapel would be really surprised to know that that letter happened. Because when you consider all the real difficulties, kind of a mild, even let's call it a mild persecution that was going on at one time, how much has changed. With the Orthodox churches, we're very, very close, very warm relationship with them. We gather monthly. The priests enjoy each other very much, and so that certainly has changed. With the Anglican Church, at one time, the Catholic Church thought that that was going to be the church that we would reunite with after the Second Vatican Council. It did look very hopeful. But that has completely reversed. That's one of the Christian churches that is furthest away from us now in the Word area. It is the fortunate, what would you call it? Well, the fruit of that dysfunction. But now we have the Word area. And then the Lutheran Church, we're very close to, but it is broken into many pieces, partly due to the secular influences that come in, especially sexuality. The Methodist Church has just broken into two, and you'll see that it was upwards between 200 and 300 churches that just last week decided to leave the Methodist Church. So an awful lot going on there for the same reasons. Presbyterian Church is also suffering. So most of those mainline churches are going through an awful lot of upset and confusion. So we actually represent something of the tradition and the weightiness of the history of the church and founded by Christ and so forth. And so that appeals more and more as a lot of other communities are really losing their focus, say. So it has been a huge shift, definitely.
Well, while we prepare to mic up Father Al for his presentation on St. Lazarus, let's thank Father Claude for his presentation. So Father Glenn Botten is a living example of what Father Al just talked about in terms of not only Pastor Chuck, but then also the journey that we've all been on these last 70 years and the fraying apart about the culture and the different things. And Father's, fullness in the community came not because he wanted to be a priest, but because he wanted to land in a church to have the fullness of truth. And when he and Kathy came into the church, it was with no idea that he would ever be ordained. It was just they were tired of the dysfunction that Father talked about. And how we became associated with Father Glenn was through Father Andrew Vardis, who founded St. John Henry Newman here in Orange County, which is where Greg Hare is a member, in fact, one of the founding members of that parish. And the Lord put it on Greg's heart to start this chapter of St. Peter Claver. And I go to church there because my daughter's a member of the ordinary, and Greg's there every Sunday, heads up in the bulletin. And I just like, Greg, what are you doing with the St. Peter Claver thing? I just don't get it. But he has it on his heart that no, this is exactly what Father talked about. It's about an openness and integration of all of us together. And I've learned so much about, St. Peter Claver, but more importantly about this idea of what Father talked about, we all come around the table together. So something's happening here in Orange County that's very unique, and I think it's very reflective of just, something about Orange County. If you've been here 5 years, you're a native. Everybody's from someplace else. I grew up in Orange County, but again, like Father said, I'm from the same parish. Just we're always welcoming new people. There's an openness in Orange County that, no disrespect to those guys who've been inside of the 605, it's on the rules. It's just something about Orange County that's welcoming. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about this thing called the Knights of St. Lazarus. Now, who has ever heard of the Knights of St. Lazarus? I only heard about it because the 6'8" guy over here took me to once he said, hey, we're gonna be, doing something tonight to St. Lazarus. What's the Knights of St. Lazarus? Come on, learn about it. So, again, when we're talking about these pontifical chivalric orders that are rooted in the Middle Ages, that served a role of protection of the Christian missionaries, this particular order is at the forefront. And they have an additional charism, which Father Al's going to probably talk about, which is they're the only Catholic sovereign order that is open to non-Catholics. So again, getting back to this idea of ecumenism and a place where people have a common ground. So Father Al, as we talked about, is a priest of the Diocese of Orange. He is formerly the Episcopal Vicar for Interreligious Dialogue and Ecumenism in Orange. Then Bishop Van allowed him to go to the USCCB, where he served in the national office for that aspect. Came back, was our director of Vicar for Evangelization and Faith Formation. And most recently now he's in residence at Blessed Sacrament. He's also doing priest supply over at St. Anne's in Seal Beach. So with that, please welcome Father Alban.
Actually, now I live at St. Anne's.
Even better.
Beach, which is wonderful because it's just walking distance right to the pier. It's a beautiful community of about maybe 750 families. So I do especially adult education. Tonight I'm giving, been doing a series on angels. Tonight it's on devils. Next week it's on exorcism, haunted houses, and ghosts. So that probably should have been in October. But one thing about the Ordinariate in Orange County is I was the chaplain for the Ordinariate when it began, and I helped Father artists to kind of form and shape that community. And then a beautiful experience of bringing in all those wonderful souls at San Juan Catholic Fraternal Organization. So a nice connection there. And I was thinking when you were talking about St. Peter Claver, one of the things that I remember that was so impressive about him as well, Saint, was that there came a time when he tried to have himself sold in order to get money to help the slaves. So it was such a, if you can imagine, such a desperate situation where these ships would come in who've been on the waters for so long. You have people that now that are destitute, people that are, are fractured with illness and everything else, and he would go into the galleys and begin to comfort and strengthen, and then find a way to get these people out, of a new slavery that was developing, of course, terrifically in the world at that time. So it was a tremendous thing. The order, Mark really nailed it pretty well on what we're about. I decided to do a show and tell. This is what we wear. And you notice that the cross is the same cross as the Knights of Malta, except they're red. The Knights of Holy Sepulchre, different color again, brown. And so ours is green. And I really didn't know that much about the order either until I got very involved in ecumenism and interreligion. I was sent by the diocese to the Angelicum in Rome and studied there for 2 years, and then came back home with my license. And I did my license on the healing of memories, which John Paul II brought to the church, this new idea that using and comparing that to the psychological model, so that we understand this very easily that when something goes wrong, there's a deep wound or hurt in a person that you can't just pretend it's not there anymore. You have to go back and treat it. And part of it is trying to understand where the wound came from and being honest about that, which can be very challenging too. And then once you understand as best you can why the wound is there, then you begin to treat it. Well, John Paul said, this model and so much more to it really also works among churches. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, with the Orthodox, it's not enough to just say, let's get back together, it's time. But we have to go back and look at the original wounds, look at history, frankly, and remember John Paul always used to say, we're not afraid of history. The church is not afraid of history. And so if there are things that went wrong, we acknowledge that. And if there are things that we need to apologize, we certainly have done that. John Paul was very important with that, but that continues even through the pontificate of Francis. So once we were able to assess the woundedness and then begin to heal it, then that brings us to help. And then that way we don't fall back right into the wound. And that's the big grace of this, is that if we can figure out what went wrong with churches back in the day, then we can close the door and we can learn from what was a wound. So thanks be to God today, nobody is burning anybody at the stake anymore, as far as Protestant and Catholics. But there is still, certainly pockets of fear and a inability to maybe reach out beyond one's comfort of one's faith. But the Catholic Church, as St. John Paul II said, is irrevocably committed to the restoration of Christian unity. So you remember that what that means is that we're not creating a new church. That's impossible. What we're trying to do is rediscover what was before. So that for over 1,000 years, there was only one church. Even though there was a variation of how that played out, but in the essentials, there was only one church. And so the Catholic Church remains committed to a vision that before the second coming of Christ, we as a mother church need to do what we can to bring back the churches that have walked away from us. It's like, again, a mother and her kids. Mom is always worried about the kids and setting the table and the dinner Sunday night and waiting. And maybe they don't come. But every Sunday night she does that. And she waits and hoping that they'll come home. And in a sense, that's the image I have of the Catholic Church. So this order that we belong to is actually older, really, than I'd say than the Middle Ages. We go back to 1098. That's when most of the great orders began in response to what was happening in the Middle East and with Islam on the rise. And we were especially committed, and still are, to the eradication of leprosy, or Hansen's disease. That still continues today. But that was always a special niche or gift of the order, even back then. Today also it extends to promoting organ and tissue donation. So I'm encouraging people to give that final gift to others. And it's built on, the order is built on three spiritualities, or three pillars. One is spirituality, and as we hear, we are the only Catholic order that is open to other faith traditions coming in, but they must accept and support the Nicene Creed. So they have to be Trinitarian. So Mary Baker Eddy and these other interesting communities that began in the United States in the 1800s, but really have floated away from a Trinitarian stance, would not be able to enter into this order. And the hope is that by bringing together different traditions within the order, what we do is we model for our churches how we can work together, care for each other, love each other, even though we're not yet united by one faith, one Christian faith. We do not celebrate Mass together because that is impossible at this point. We do pray together. We have different celebrations together. We're made up of mostly high church Anglicans, Lutherans, and then a smattering of some other communities, Orthodox. And so, especially with the Anglicans, it's very easy to pray the rosary with them because they already do that. So Anglicanism is an interesting umbrella. As Father knows, it tries to take in everything, which doesn't work either. But but there certainly is the high church that is, they're the heirs of their own founding, from Henry VIII, and that disaster of 4 or 6 women that only one survived, and I think, or 2, and Anna Cleves did pretty well. But you have to read Anna Cleves. She's an interesting queen, and she's being looked at again. All of those women are being looked at again, and we have so much more light to shine upon them. But Anna Cleves, came from a Protestant kingdom. That's why Henry VIII wanted to marry her at that time, because he wanted to consolidate the Protestant world against Spain in particular, but also France. And she arrives, and then, within days or so, he says, "I don't like her." And so Henry did a fascinating thing. She arrived on the shores of England, and then he went disguised to see her and brought a gift. And then he laid it in front of her and went to kiss her, and she was aghast, because she's a proper princess. And so she stepped away in horror, and the whole thing fell apart, and he was embarrassed, and then he left, and then she realized, oh my gosh, that was a king. And but this was chivalry, English chivalry, where the prince brings in disguise a gift, and then the lady is supposed to recognize him. So he was, coming through this from a whole different direction as she was, understanding culturally. And so from that moment on, it just went down. When she realized that she was getting close to a divorce and maybe something worse after that, she cooperated with Henry, to his surprise, about a divorce. And so the divorce went through, and he was so happy that he told her, "You will be third in the kingdom, and you are welcome at the court anytime." And he gave her revenue and houses, and she lived out her life independently for a woman of her age, and much beloved in the English court. She never went back to her homeland. And through the deep friendship with Mary Tudor, she became a Catholic. And she became a Catholic. So she's a fascinating woman. Anyway, so you get me going all along these things. But the spirituality then is ecumenical. I would say that the majority of members are Catholic, and so a lot of what we do remains very Catholic themed. We are throughout the world, not just here in the United States, of course, but we're all over the world. And we just had bringing in new knights and ladies, and that was done in Washington, D.C. with the Cardinal. The year before that, I think we were in Los Angeles at some Archbishop Gomez, and so it just, moves along. But we usually bring in one of the Catholic prelates. We're also, of course, dedicated to charity, and so the big part of that is Hansen's disease. But it also becomes a priority of looking at other needs that members will bring forward. We vote on those needs, and then we place money and assistance towards them. There is also a big push towards chivalry. And much like the other great orders, when you enter, there is a certain personality to an order, an expectation. And for us, chivalry means courtesy. It means respect, even though someone else is different. It means that we are good listeners. And I would say that in the community we have, the United States, and specifically in California, we have about 75 members or so. And that plays out very well. It's oftentimes difficult for me to know who's Catholic and who isn't. It's so warm. And we do a Lent and Advent retreat, the Catholics, that we put on for everybody. Most of this happens in Pasadena at St. Andrew's Church. And Father Marcos Gonzalez, the pastor, is a member of the order. Bishop Tim Fryer and myself are the only two in Orange County that are members, clergy members. And then we have a Christmas gathering, which is coming up, which would be beautiful too, and very festive and prayerful and joyful. So this is who we are, and I guess the beauty for me of it is that I do belong to the Knights of Holy Sepulchre and Knights of Columbus, but what is so specifically beautiful about this is the ecumenical dimension, which I appreciate and love very much, as I still love that work very much. So, open up to questions.
Yeah. When you talk about bringing in members, the last one was in Washington, the other ones from now, which are part of the Washington. Is it like once a year with the president, or is it like?
Yes, it runs just
Knights
like,
of Columbus is like daily.
yeah, Knights of Columbus is a little bit different, but the old orders, and they're really true knighthoods. And you're knighted, you know, when the cardinal, he used to take a sword, now he uses the disclosure. And that was because the Vatican asked us to do that. So, but the old orders, every year, we bring in and we introduce new hospital members. And then if that looks like a good fit, then they become part of the order.
SSPX members, do you have many of those?
We don't have any SSPX members, and that's probably because they're very exclusive themselves. I don't think they would reach out to us. There's, you know, it's like when I was in Garden Grove as pastor at St. Columban, there was a church, Our Lady of Refuge, it's still there, and that's a breakaway. And they aren't even a breakaway, I think, from SSPX. But they sent me a note on saying, well, this person goes to our church and they were baptized at your church, but we're saying we would like to have you put in your books that they were confirmed recently at our church. So I said, okay, thank you, and I put that in our books, a little memo about it and everything next to it. And then I reached out to them and I told them we're having a procession through the streets. And with the Blessed Sacrament, would you like to join us? What we would do is we'd have over 1,000 people go through the streets at night, all the different languages, English, Vietnamese, Spanish, carrying the Blessed Sacrament, carrying the Virgin Mary. Then we would come back to St. Columba's Church and end with benediction in Latin. And it was wonderful. And so they wouldn't join us. And even for that, you know, I knew they would join us for Mass, but I was hoping maybe for the, procession. But then I thought it out, well, they don't accept that we have a valid Eucharist, so for them it was a procession with nothing. So unfortunately. So SSPX is really, out there on its own.
Well, they're all Baca.